if Jeff was going to do anything, but he seems to be hanging back, so maybe not. If Jeff was going to do anything to kick us off, but I think it's all on me. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. It seems like we are at the hour, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Mark R. Warren. Getting my water, thank you. It's on an angle. Yeah, I'll hold it. A sociologist concerned with the revitalization of American democratic and community life. He studies efforts to strengthen institutions that anchor low-income communities, schools, churches, and other community-based organizations, and to build broad-based alliances among these institutions across race and social class. Dr. Warren studies and works with community and youth organizing groups to promote equity and justice in education, community development, and civic engagement. A 2020 American Educational Research Association Fellow, his expertise includes community organizing, education reform, race and racial justice, and faith-based initiatives. He is the co-founder of ARA, Special Interest Group on Grassroots Community and Youth Organizing for Education Reform, the founder of the Urban Research-Based Action Network, and the People's Think Tank. And most importantly for us today, he is the author of the Grawemeyer award-winning book, Willful Defiance, The Movement to Dismantle the School-to-Prison Pipeline. I was so inspired by this book that which I realized I didn't introduce myself as the Dean of the College of Education and Human Development, launched the Dean's Book Club, composed of students, faculty, and staff, all reading and discussing this work. We've met monthly, interrogating what these ideas mean for us in our own lives and the times we're living in. Today, I believe that you too will find him evocative and leave here with much food for thought to continue to chew on over lunch. And so without further ado, it is my utmost pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Warren, Professor of Sociology at the University of Massachusetts in Boston and the author of the award-winning book, Willful Defiance. Please give him a warm welcome.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dean, and thanks so much to the Grawemeyer Award Committee for this award. It's really an honor, and it's an award I've known about for a long time. And I've known a few people who have gotten it before. So I was thrilled to receive it, and of course it comes with a nice prize, which I plan to use to fund my sabbatical to work on the next book that I'm doing with the community partners. So it would be a nice reinvestment in, I think, the work that we're trying to do to support parents and young people who are organizing for racial justice and educational transformation. So thank you so much for that. I'm happy to be here today. I've never been to Louisville or Kentucky, and so I'm from Boston, and so my wife and I were frantically hearing about the flooding and had no idea what that meant, and we were saying, well, where's the university? Is it near the river? How far away from the river do you have to be? And of course, we had no idea. So anyway, it seems like I got here and people have been very nice, and it's been dry for me. So I appreciate all that. So, all right, I'm going to talk probably for about 30 or 35 minutes to try to give you a sense of the work that I've done that came out in the book, Willful Defiance, A Movement to Dismantle the School-to-Prison Pipeline. And I want to also, even though it's an interesting situation, I'm a sociologist. I also consider myself a community-engaged scholar. I do my work in partnership with parent and youth and community organizing groups. And so I had a number of partners that I worked with in producing this book. So there's a little dynamic between getting an individual award. Yes, I am the author of this book, but I didn't do it on my own, and so I want to thank and recognize all the wide range of community partners that I had that I'll mention here and there through the course of the talk. So Let me start, I would like to start with a little bit about how the book opens. So this is a book about the school-to-prison pipeline, but it's really a book about how parents and young people and communities, particularly African American and Latinx communities, have organized and became a force to confront the school-to-prison pipeline and work to dismantle it. And to me, it's very important that I tell the stories of many of the people that I interviewed who became, who were parents or who were young people who became organizers. And so the book starts with the story of Zakiya Sakari Jabbar. She was in Dayton, Ohio at the time, a working single mom. She went back to college to get a degree, and she put her son, Amir, African-American boy, in preschool. And she says here, quote, "The problems began right away. The preschool gave me a hard time enrolling him in the first place. Then in the first week, I started to receive phone calls telling me, quote, he had a temper tantrum today. He's not wanting to transition from one activity to another. Is that not normal, I replied. Is that not something that your teachers can deal with? Then the preschool asked me to have Amir evaluated. Evaluated for what? It was as if he was a guinea pig. They made normal 3-year-old behavior sound very pathologized and abnormal. And I realize now that I don't think we were ever really wanted there. So Zakiya refused to have him evaluated, and the preschool actually expelled Amir. And then he was suspended multiple times at other preschools. She went to the college library and did a literature search on black boys in education and found her son's experience was not unique. And she started talking with other African-American parents, and so many of them had the same kind of experience. And she began meeting in living rooms with these parents across the city in Dayton, and they formed an organization called Racial Justice Now and started to organize to confront many of these issues. And in the book, I tell in more detail the stories of how these groups have organized. But they had a local organization in Dayton, and they got support from the National Dignity in Schools campaign that provided lots of resources and training for them. And together, in a few years, they won a moratorium on pre-K suspension in Dayton, Ohio, changed the district's code of conduct to end zero tolerance, discipline policies, won implementation of restorative justice in 10 schools, and they actually issued a school discipline report card for school districts across Ohio, which is very interesting because they gave many of the predominantly white affluent districts failing grades on school discipline. And these are all districts who were used to getting A grades. And they said, well, you don't suspend that many students, but extremely high proportion of the students that you do suspend are the few black students that are actually in your schools. In any case, at the end of the interview, she reflects on the depth of the system that they're confronting. And she said at this time, Amir is in the 4th grade now, and this school year has been one of the most difficult. No matter what I do, I can't make the teacher see us differently. I can't make her love Amir. I can't make her see him as an energetic 9-year-old boy who has some leadership qualities that she could cultivate instead of viewing him as a menace or a nuisance. So that's the story that opens the book. And people may or may not know that 50,000 students are suspended or expelled from pre-K school every year. 50,000 black boys being the largest proportionate group out of that category. Let me turn for a minute then from that story to the title of the book, Willful Defiance. So many people don't know that hundreds of thousands of students are suspended from schools every year for something called willful defiance. Sometimes it's called disrupting school, sometimes it's called willful disruption. This is the California Education Code. Disrupting school activities are otherwise willfully defying the authority of supervisors, informants of their duty. It's a vague, subjective term which lends itself to racial and other kinds of intersectional disproportionality. And it leads, in many states, it is not just cause for suspension, but it's actually a criminal violation. And in 2015, there was a very famous case where a girl named Shakira in Spring Valley, South Carolina, was in a classroom, and the teacher said, I want you to hand me your cell phone. And she said, I don't have my cell phone with me. And he said, well, I've had enough of you. I'm calling in the vice principal. And the Christ Pistol came in and he said, I want you to hand in yourself. I said, I don't have it on me. And he said, well, I've had enough of you. Called in the school resource officer, which is somewhat of an equivalent of a police officer in school. And there he is grabbing her and throwing her to the ground and dragging her across the floor of the classroom. And another girl, Nia Kenny, in the classroom took a cell phone video of it, and it went viral. The two girls were charged with the criminal violation of disrupting school. It's a criminal violation. It was at the time in South Carolina. And the SRO was never charged with anything. So it led to, it sort of sparked a national campaign. Young people across the country responded and sent love letters to them, and there was a petition campaign, and eventually the charges were dropped. But it was a very important moment that really raised the question of what is the role of SROs, what is the role of police officers in schools. The book itself tries to raises this sort of question, and that's why we use the title Willful Defiance. Well, if the system is really designed to punish, control, and criminalize young people, then maybe they should be willfully defiant of that system. But maybe it doesn't really work. It makes sense to be an individual trying to stand up to this. How do we think about young people and parents and communities coming together, forming a variety of alliances to really try to change these kinds of policies and practices? And so the book is really making, I think, kind of two large points. One is the vital importance of people who are most impacted by injustice being really at the center and the drivers of the movement. Not alone, but at the foundation of that. So whether that's young people who are being disciplined or arrested in schools, or whether it's their parents or other community members, those people at the heart. And then the second, how to think about what it means to organize on a local level and connect those efforts up nationally to create something that not necessarily focuses on Washington, but is a national collaboration that strengthens and supports and makes more effective what people are doing in their local areas. And I was saying before that I think in the current political environment right now, maybe that's even more important to try to understand how local organizations can really make changes there. I don't want to talk a lot about the school-to-prison pipeline itself, but I think that it's usually understood sort of in the most practical policy terms or focus terms as school discipline policies and practices that suspend and expel students at very large numbers, often for very minor behavioral infractions, like being willfully defiant. If you don't take your hat off in class, you could be suspended or even expelled in many places. That's often called zero tolerance. We have no tolerance for any misbehavior at all. So school discipline policies or exclusionary school discipline policies, and then also policing policies and practices that end up with a whole set of things that are about metal detectors and prison-like environments in school. Thousands of students who are arrested right in school. So it's creating an environment in school that is very either prison-like or about punishment and control rather than about support and education of young people. This is something that young people in New York City put together to try to do this. And if I can, I'm not sure if I can scroll a little bit. No, I guess it's not going. That's okay. This is not a small problem. As I said before, hundreds of thousands of students are suspended and expelled for things like willful defiance every year. Black boys are 3 times more likely to be suspended than white boys. Black girls are actually 6 times more likely to be expelled than white girls. It's a very racialized system. We also have very high levels of, I don't have this over here. I'll go back to that. High levels of police presence now in schools. So, and it's something that really arose in the 1990s, kind of at the same time that mass incarceration was happening in communities. So the presence of police and zero tolerance practices that led to the arrests and convictions of a lot of black and brown men and other community members in communities. At the same time, children were being disciplined and arrested under the same kinds of philosophies. So as I said, it's a big problem. 75% of all black students in the state of Texas are suspended at some point in secondary school. So 75%. If you're a black boy with a disability, 89% are suspended. So almost every single one is suspended. So, and the costs of this are very large. If you are, again, a black boy who does, so if you're suspended or expelled, you're very much more likely not to graduate from high school. If you're a black boy that doesn't graduate from high school, your chance of ending up in prison, does anyone know what that chance is? It's 2/3. So 2/3 of all black men without a high school degree will end up in prison at some point in their lives. 1/3 are in prison at any one time. Now, what is not often understood is the sort of what I talk about as intergenerational transmission. So oftentimes, while if a parent is incarcerated, it's more likely that their child will end up being suspended or expelled or arrested themselves. It turns out that 40% of all black children by the age of 14 has had a parent who's been incarcerated in this country. So it's a really staggering large system that is completely racialized. So we're facing not just a set of misguided discipline policies, we are really facing a system that has been brought in and imposed, not just in one particular place, not just in one particular state, but really all across the country in the 90s and early 2000s. In the 1970s, there were 100 police officers in schools in the entire country, 100. By the early 2000s, there was 14,000. And now I think the latest figures were up to 30 or 40,000 police officers in school. Some school districts actually have actually regular police stations right in schools. The Los Angeles School Police received a tank and semi-automatic weapons from the federal government under the 1033 program. You might ask the question, why does a school police department need to have a tank and semi-automatic weapons? But in fact, they did. And one of the campaigns that I documented in the book was the organizing to get them to return that equipment and apologize. Anyway, so it's a deep-seated system, and so I tried to go back and trace, okay, well, where did this movement really originate, right? When did people first start to speak out against it? And there were a few educators, there were a few policy people in the 90s who were talking about school discipline, but it wasn't very many. It really turns out that it was African-American parents and young people who were really the first to speak out about that system, almost at the very beginning when it was being imposed. So I ended up in Holmes County, Mississippi, trying to find some of the first efforts around this. And I met a group of people, Helen Johnson, and a number of others who were part of a network called Southern Echo. And in the mid-90s, they were, so this is quite a while ago now, they were out on a street corner and saw all of these black children out of school. They tried to find out what was going on. There was a very famous case where black children were throwing popcorn at each other on a school bus, and a piece of popcorn hit the back of the white school bus driver's head, and she drove the bus straight to the police station, and 7 black boys were arrested and charged with criminal assault for hitting the white school bus driver with a piece of popcorn. And this was what I could find and document was the first campaign. They launched a campaign to drop the charges against those boys, and it was what I could document as the first campaign that was launched against the school-to-prison pipeline. They called it the schoolhouse to jailhouse track at the time. So they had that kind of analysis already back in their community a long time before scholars like myself or policymakers or even the traditional civil rights community was really talking about these things. So the book then tries to chart the building of this kind of movement and how what happened in Mississippi then inspired a group of black and brown parents in South Los Angeles called Cadre, who started meeting in people's living rooms, with parents talking with each other about their experiences of their children in school, and when they tried to go in and challenge some of these practices of suspensions or that they themselves were harassed or abused, and sometimes police were called on them. And so they started to organize, and they went door knocking, and they launched a campaign in Los Angeles, and they became the kind of community base that eventually in 2007 got the Los Angeles School District to issue a statement against zero-tolerance school discipline and develop an alternative, which at the time was called School-Wide Positive Behavior and Supports. It was the first campaign win against that system of zero tolerance. It reverberated around the country and inspired people in Denver here and in Chicago and others, and it ended up launching what was called the Dignity in Schools campaign, a national coalition of organizing groups. And the book tries to talk about that relationship between, it wasn't really a Washington-based organization advocating there. It was an effort to say, well, how do we really connect people who are trying to struggle in their isolated areas together to build the kind of resources that could then come back to those local areas to make them more effective. And so this group, Padres Jóvenes Unidos, were the first they launched a campaign around policing in school, and they got the school district to revise their memo of agreement with the Denver Police Department to lessen police presence and activities in schools. And then a group of young people in Chicago launched a campaign. It was one of the first statewide campaigns to end zero tolerance with state policy. So much of the book tries to talk a little bit about, well, certainly the voice of Black and brown parents and young people is really important, but also how do we really organize to create these kinds of changes? Over the years, the campaign grew as a kind of diverse and intergenerational and intersectional movement. There started to be discussion of the particular situation of Black and gender nonconforming girls who were being disciplined, or encounters with police that were very gendered as well, by their dress or various kinds of issues in trying to get through metal detectors with things in their hair, and then ending up late for class, and then being suspended for being late for class. And then the particular issues of the LGBTQ plus youth of color who were often caught up in this kind of zero tolerance method. So if they were being harassed, if they eventually were to fight back against some other schoolmates, or perhaps police or others who were harassing them, then they would also be charged with fighting in school and then suspended or expelled from fighting when they were trying to defend themselves. So it became a very large movement across the whole country that had various kinds of elements trying to work together. And in 2020, I think we saw in the wake of the George Floyd mass protests this wave of efforts to either remove police from schools or defund school police departments. Most people don't know that actually many of these organizing groups have been working on this issue for 10 years prior to this point. The Black Organizing Project in Oakland had announced in 2012 that they were going to remove all police from Oakland schools within 10 years. And of course, they were told they're crazy. You're never going to do that. Police, have to be in schools. And so they had already prepared. They had been building a base of support. They had been working with people on the school board. So when the protests came through in 2020, it was a moment that they could seize upon. And then they passed a resolution. They removed police from Oakland schools, and they set up a community-based system to work on alternatives with restorative and transformative justice that I can also talk about. So I think it's important to, and then you may know that 130 school districts either removed police from schools in the wake of that George Floyd process. Some of there's been pushback, some have been brought back to school. It turns out that the places where I think the organizing groups had been doing this work for a long time, most of those places, like Oakland, have been able to sustain the removal of police from schools. Let me see what I'm okay, doing okay. So I just want to say a few things about the accomplishments and the challenges of the movement. So it's really an amazing story because from the sort of origins in the mid-1990s up until around 2012 and 2014, in the mid-2000s, all of the national discourse was for zero tolerance, which, by the way, I mean, the idea that you would suspend or expel students, that there were bad kids in the school and you had to remove the bad kids so the good kids could learn. Now, when 89% of black boys with disabilities apparently are bad kids in the state of Texas and all have to be removed. Something's wrong with this narrative. But in any case, it was really the official policy in districts all across the country and enshrined in state policy. Both national teachers unions had officially endorsed zero tolerance. All the national education professional associations all were lined up behind zero tolerance. So when this movement in 2008 announced their intention to end zero tolerance, they were also told, you're crazy, you're never going to do this. Within 6 years, they had shifted the national discourse. There was a rolling series of victories at local and state level to end zero tolerance discipline policies. The federal government in 2014, under the Obama administration, issued guidance to school districts warning them against racial discriminatory school discipline policies and the school-to-prison pipeline. Now, they didn't do it alone, and they ended up with a number of different allies. The National Teachers Union finally did change their policies, and the AFT actually issued an apology for supporting zero tolerance. But it was really the grassroots element that really turned the tide on it. And as a result of these victories, exclusionary discipline statistics did start to fall. So in places particularly where there was sustained and long-term organizing, like in Los Angeles, in 2006 to 7, I think there were 75,000 days lost by students for suspensions. 10 years later, that number was down to 5,600. So from 75,000 to 5,600. So at least those students were in school and at least presumably learning, and beginnings to defund or remove police from schools, as I was talking about. Again, we're now in a very contentious period around all of these things. But what happens in Washington matters a lot, but it doesn't determine what happens in local school districts. And so these changes were being made across different periods of administrations. And I think it's also important to understand that in some ways, the school-to-prison pipeline has been a nonpartisan or bipartisan agenda. So if we look at places where we have exclusionary discipline and police practices, they are in Republican conservative areas and they are in Democratic liberal areas. New York City has an entrenched system, so does Los Angeles, so does Boston, where I am. So this has been a bipartisan agenda, and so the organizing efforts really have to be very deep-seated and rooted. There's still, I think, a number of enduring challenges, including our current period. Even though suspensions have fallen in a number of places, the racial disparities have not. So even in places like Los Angeles that significantly reduced the number of suspensions, black boys are still 3 times as likely to be suspended in these reduced numbers. And so there's something that is even deeper seated in the system that simply policy and policy changes is not really getting at. And I tried to hint at that with the quotation from Zakiya Sankara-Jabbar at the beginning. I can't make a teacher love my son. We can change policies, and that matters for sure, but we also have to have ways of getting deeper into schools and changing the hearts and minds of the folks who are there. So the enduring racial disparities, the persistence of police and policing practices, new forms of surveillance coming from COVID. These are very deep-seated. It's not just about the removal of police from schools. They can also be called back in. There's a whole set of practices that I was talking about in terms of like metal detectors and just a kind of punishment and discipline kind of system. By the way, there is actually, there is no evidence that the presence of police in schools makes schools safer for students or for anyone. So I'll just repeat that. There is actually no evidence that the presence of police in schools makes schools safer, either on a daily basis or in terms of mass shootings. So there's no evidence for it, and yet that practice is deep and persistent. And then I think the challenge of creating authentic alternatives that really transform schools. And this, of course, is on the minds of teachers, but it's also on the minds of young people who want to be safe and supported in schools, and parents too. And so I talked a little bit about positive behavior interventions and supports, but there's also a lot of work thinking about how to develop restorative justice practices or transformative justice practices. that try to get more at the causes of issues that arise in school rather than disciplining and punishing or expelling the students who are practicing them. You know, that's a big issue because really I think a lot of the community groups look at this from the point of view of, well, it's not really about just how to, if a couple students are fighting, let's do restorative justice rather than expelling them. Yes, let's form a circle, for those who know something about it, and try to work together to get at the causes of this, the harm from it, and some restitution. But really, if a whole school has set up in this kind of harsh discipline way and with policing, then it's really the whole school that needs to be going through a restorative justice program if you're really thinking about, you know, building a culture of relational support for students. So I just wanted to end a little bit on, you know, the school-to-prison pipeline is, I think, really the most, it's right at the center of what's happening, I think, in our country around educational injustice issues. And I think that, you know, it makes sense that the organizing groups, parents and young people, and myself are very focused on that. But in many ways, it's really an opening to a larger conversation about what kind of public education we have. And in some ways, we were talking about this earlier, the two worlds of public education in this country. And I often go, I know probably here people are more knowledgeable, but I'll often go and talk to you know, more affluent, whiter audiences in suburbs, and they have absolutely no idea what's going on in schools in many of our urban or low-income communities of color in urban areas. It's about the school-to-prison pipeline. It's about policing and discipline, but it's also about structurally unfunded education. It's about whether the education is culturally relevant. It's about who's teaching in the schools. And it's about, you know, issues of poverty and racism and environmental degradation and food deserts that exist in the communities in which young people are coming into schools. So I hope that this work on the school-to-prison pipeline really helps to open up a conversation about really what we really need to do to really transform public education in this country. And I think if I want to leave you with a couple of messages, it's one is that, you know, we have to find ways to support and promote and work with community organizing groups who are often at the heart of the injustices and have a kind of lived experience as well as a community wisdom, oftentimes a history of organizing that they can bring into the struggle to transform our schools. And rather than pushing them out or working at cross purposes with them, how can we bring people together to fight the system on its own? And secondly, how do we value and focus on what we can be doing at the local level? You know, our public education system is still primarily local. We have efforts of the federal government to influence and what's going to happen locally or at the state level, but it doesn't fully determine it. And so we have to find ways to do that. And then in my own work, as the dean was mentioning, I've been trying to set up different kinds of collaboratives that bring, in my world of scholars, together with community organizers, and we now have something called the People's Think Tank for Educational Justice. And I think, I'm not sure if it's the next slide. Oh yeah, so these are some of my grassroots partners that I've worked with for this book and other work. It includes the Dignity in Schools campaign. It includes cadre that I was talking about in Los Angeles. It includes groups from all over the country in our People's Think Tank. And I will end just with a few statistics also that I think show that what the larger system that we're up against. So we are a country now where 1.7 million students go to school with cops but no counselors. Right? 3 million are in schools with cops but no nurses. 6 million go to school with schools that have police officers but no school psychologists. And 10 million students go to school in schools that have police officers in them and no social workers. So I feel it's a big challenge. It's a challenge for all of us and wherever we are, because I do believe that the dreams and the hopes of African American community for full access and quality education as a part of the democratic struggle is important for African American community, for the Latinx community, but I think it's also important for all of us who care about the future of democracy in this country. So thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Valentine, and I'm the director of the Grawemeyer Award in Education, and we have time for Q&A with Dr. Warren. I will run the microphone around the room, so raise your hand if you'd like to say something, have a question, and when you do, please introduce yourself. Who's first?
I'm David Buckley from the Political Science Department. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the connections between the very earliest stages where individual isolated parents in low resource environments are frustrated.
Right.
And then this slide where people are organized and have campaigns that have concrete deliverables that they're asking through the connection to local school and political officials. How did these parents organize themselves in these local under-resourced communities in the early stages of these campaigns? Like what as a scholar did you observe in that stage?
Yeah. So thanks for the question, and I'm looking forward to more questions. I really enjoyed and I value I think we really need to engage on these issues rather than just listen to me talking about them. So I'm interested in what you have to say or the questions that you have as well, because I think that's one piece of what's going to get us more towards solutions. And I really strongly believe that. I am one person, and I've written this book that I think is a contribution, but it's really going to take a much larger movement. So so these are, I think, really good questions. And we have this tradition of community organizing in this country that goes back a very long time. And so some of the early groups kind of came out of that community organizing trend. So for example, Holmes County turns out to be a seat of a lot of civil rights organizing in the 60s and 70s. So it wasn't just an isolated area, right? It was an area where people had had a history. There was a whole, I don't want to get all into it, but there were, had been independent black farmers in that Holmes County area. So they were somewhat protected from retaliation by white elites because they had their own economic base. So that was one of the reasons that Holmes County became a center for the organizing. So when we get to the sort of 90s, there are some people who have come out of that tradition who know something about organizing and working with people. And so Helen Johnson and her sister Ellen Reddy were there. They were working in a community-based organization called the Nolly Jenkins Family Center. So they became a place where parents could gather around. And I think one of the very important parts of what they do, and it gets back to the issue of story, helping people to come together and share their stories with each other. Because many people will believe that, well, it's, my child is at fault. Or, there's oftentimes a message that, well, it's the parent's fault, or it's the child. If the child's being suspended, there's something wrong with the family, there's something wrong with the child. And it's maybe not that people fully internalize that, but they only maybe have had their own individual experience. So similar with the Zakiya Sakari Jabbar in Dayton, that idea of going door to door, bringing people together in living rooms, sharing stories, for people to start to understand, well, there's something bigger going on here. It's not just me and my child, it's you and yours and you and yours, and now all of a sudden there's lots of people. So the storytelling became a very important part. And then they often got connected up to whether it was researchers or others who could look at the situation from a more quantitative statistical point of view. So because they would start to go and tell their stories, and then some of the school boards or other power holders say, well, that's just a few people's stories. So they also needed some data to back it up. And so these were very early days. There wasn't a lot of data. We may not be getting more data. It was at one point where the Office of Civil Rights started requiring school districts to report this data, right? But in the earlier days, they had to go out and do their own surveys, right, and start to collect some larger data. So part of it, I think, was the combination of the personal stories and witnessing and testimony, as well as the data that showed it was a larger problem that was a very important part of their organizing campaigns. And we were talking about this last night. I think that I throw up statistics like this, and they're shocking, or the statistics of Texas students, but it doesn't necessarily move people to action, right? It seems at a distance. It's not. But when parents and young people started to tell their stories, they were putting a human face. These are real people. These young people, the ones in Chicago who went to the State House, which is like a 3-hour drive from Chicago, they would get on buses early in the morning and go down and lobby the legislatures to end these zero tolerance policies. It's hard to say, well, these are bad students or something wrong with them. Here they are, civically engaged, making the effort, trying to work with other young people. This is what we should be lifting up as a model of a student, and instead these are students who are being suspended or expelled or whatever. So there's a lot more to say, and they also then formed alliances oftentimes with legal advocates in the very early days. Some of the suits had to do with disability rights because there wasn't the sort of racial disproportionality part. So they would form alliances with legal advocates and others. So even though I'm saying that it's parents and young people at the heart of the movement, they really didn't create this change on their own, and they don't really have the resources to. So there were the kind of core organizing amongst parents and young people and community members, and then the formation of somewhat larger alliances to really influence policymakers and develop some of these. And then they might work with others who have had experience with restorative justice and try to develop alternatives to propose. And then I do think it's hard to summarize it easily in the book, trying to sort of look at this iteration between, well, what happens when people win something in Mississippi, and then what were some of the national infrastructures that helped connect people. And there was an organization called the Advancement Project that some people may know of. It was a legal advocacy group based in Washington, but its mission was to really do kind of lawyering in collaboration with community organizing groups. So they sponsored some of the first national gatherings of local organizers. And so people met each other there, and there started to become these connections across. This is really before the days of social media, right? And then another organization called the NESRI, the National Economic, Social, and Rights Initiative, which was a human rights-oriented organization. They started also hosting some convenings that then brought people together. So it was a kind of nascent national infrastructure where people could learn from each other, share their approaches, be inspired. So when people won in LA, it was like, oh, well, if they can win in LA, maybe we should be redoubling our efforts in New York City or wherever. And then that led to the formation of the Digging in Schools campaign. And the other group that was very prominent was the Alliance for Educational Justice, which was a national alliance of youth organizing groups that was also a partner in the project. So, does that answer some of it? Yeah, great. There's someone in the back there, I think.
Hey, my name is Ahmad Washington, Interim Department Chair of Counseling and Human Development. And I want to ask you about this slide in particular. Our department is invested in developing counselors and practitioners who oftentimes operate in schools. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, to what extent does your book deal with the very real ways that practitioners are often complicit in push-out? Yeah. And I'm thinking about one of my favorite quotes from Franz Fanon, that psychiatry and the helping professions are auxiliary of the police. Yeah. So to what extent have you thought about, even though there might be a desire to increase the number of counselors in schools, but how their preparation doesn't equip them to support and nurture this willful defiance, and actually the way that they're being prepared in colleges across the country lead them to lean into language like oppositional defiance, where they're actually complicit in those pushing and pulling out of students of color and students from underrepresented populations. Yeah.
No, thank you. It's an important question. It's a great question. You're kind of left with I think there's a point to this, right? Because it does show, like, as a society, where are our values, right? As a larger society, right? So as a larger society, if we're willing to invest in policing and disciplining, but we're not willing to invest in counseling and other kinds of things, and it's really showing the larger picture. Now we start digging deep, right, to say, okay, well, it's not just any counselors we want in the schools, right, or any school psychologists, or any social workers. And this is why I was trying to get into that earlier issue, that the disciplining and punishing and criminalizing culture in the schools is very deep. And it's not just about changing the policies, right? We have to change the people. And I think you're right that there's a range, but many counselors are in fact complicit in the system, right? And so are teachers. And in fact, one of the very controversial issues in the book and in the movement has been the relationship of the movement to teachers, right? And we'd like to be positive towards teachers, but we also have to ask the question, well, who's suspending the children in the classroom? Who's calling in the police, right? It's often teachers that are doing that. And so there has to be a transformation. Part of it is about who's going into our teaching force or our counselor force. Part of it is, how are they being trained, as you're saying, but also they're coming out of public education, right? Even before they get to the teacher training or the counselor training programs, it's not like these programs can transform people in 1 or 2 years either, right? So then it starts to get like, oh God, how are we ever going to do this? But I agree with you that it's a much larger system that really has to be challenged. And I do think that the policy changes matter. If having more counselors and less cops is a good thing overall, but it's also about how we're going to transform that. And I think that gets into the deeper local organizing. And so a lot of these groups are also involved with trying to partner with school districts if they can, or with schools to really try to support whole school transformation efforts. So and that's why I was talking about restorative justice really should not be seen as something to resolve disputes among students. It should be seen as something that can restore or transform the culture that's happening at the school, including all the adults at the school, right? Which can include everyone, including the custodian staff. Are they supporting students, or are they punishing students? Everybody's part of this system, and so everybody has to be part of the change. So, I do think we have to think about, well, who's being recruited into our teaching or professional staff force. We have to think about how they're being trained. We have to think about what happens when they get to schools. Are they being institutionalized into this culture of punishment and control, or are they being supported in maybe some of their core values? I mean, most teachers don't really go into teaching, because they want to be disciplining and punishing students, right? My own wife is a public school teacher in Boston Public Schools, and she's a pre-K teacher there. And so she works, very hard to create that kind of supportive culture in her classroom, partnering with families. But it's difficult in the larger culture and policies and practices of the district and the school. So, she struggles, and she has, there are others, she's not alone. We have a number of teachers, we have counselors out there. They need to be brought together, right, to work together to create change. So I hope I'm trying to answer a little bit what you're saying, but I agree with you, yeah. On that. Give him a move around.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for being here. My name's John Lee. I'm in the College of Education and have been an early childhood educator for about 40 years now. I wanted to build a bit on Dr. Washington's comment and talk about what I've been finding here in a new position for the past 2 years in the university and in Louisville in particular, that oftentimes in early childhood, we're so infused within the community and not typically a part of larger systems like schools, school buildings, and et cetera, that we find a little more success in building kinds of coalitions like this. Some in our own community, Play Cousins, if you've ever heard of them, Skills for Life, some of the Muhammad Ali Center work. And I wondered if you've had any experience with early childhood focused, Defending the Early Years is another one here in town, that might have a little more freedom, a little more wiggle room than often the larger systems of a school or school district constrain.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
No, thanks for your question. I can't say I'm really much of an expert on that. I know that, I think part of the larger picture is that many of these community centers where there is early childhood are more connected to the community, right? They have the relationships. And, unfortunately, so many of our public schools are like institutions located in the communities but not connected to the communities, right? And the teachers come from outside in, often they come from a different racial background or gender background than the students who are in the schools. And there are very few incentives for them to make these connections. They're also under-resourced. It's like a whole system. But I do think that, really part of what has to happen is we have to, rebuild kind of relationships that existed between schools and communities. Despite the problems with, black segregated schools, there was often much more of a connection between the teachers and the community and the families that was destroyed under desegregation. So and that's not the only issue. But in any case, some of the groups I worked with in Chicago, the parents talked about the schools. They called them fortresses. They're like, we consider them fortresses. We can't get into them. So that was very vivid. So I do think that that we could learn from these more community-based places because they have more of that kind of connection. And often they have somewhat more freedom, right, to operate. They're not so much under some of the school district policies, which, just, in a very basic level, unfortunately at my wife's school, the family community liaison person is mainly concerned about getting attendance rates up because that's what the district is imposing down on her, right? So, it's about getting the attendance up as opposed to like really dealing with the needs that families might have. So I think some of these community centers, on the other hand, they may not be very well resourced. Their teachers may not be very well paid. When pre-K programs enter into the public schools, depending on whether they're unionized or not even, but they come under different kinds of structures and they might be better paid. There are also questions about whether many of the community centers are prepared to, evaluate children. I'm not sure the situation here, but I think that's also an issue sometimes too. So I guess my 2 points would be, on the one hand, I feel like we really have to rebuild the connections between schools and communities, and this is a path forward for that. On the other hand, we have to figure out a way to how does that get into the schools, at least as we know they exist today, because the large majority of our children are going to go to these schools.
Hi, I'm Diane Neubauer. I'm assistant clinical professor, and my field is multilingual education, and I'm so new here that I still have trouble remembering my title. So I wanted to ask about teacher preparation, building on what has already been asked about counselors and early elementary or early education, early childhood education. Have you seen across the board, or as you've looked at these kinds of issues, where have there been effective change at that level of the individual teacher making changes within a classroom? Like what I'm thinking of is, I'm a teacher educator. I see that my pre-service teacher students in the University of Louisville have the ideals and the drive to want to make a difference and want to avoid these kinds of injustices. Right. But I'm concerned that idealism, like how well are we preparing them so that when they step into a classroom, they really aren't replicating some of these issues? So I'd love to see that, like the process from teacher education into early years in the field, into maybe lasting career change.
Yeah.
If you know of studies, something like that.
Yeah. So I don't know of many studies of that. I know of some examples that I've heard of or know of. I think part of it is, so we talked about not being able to, teacher education programs can't quite control who's coming into them all the time or what preparation they had before they get there. So there's an issue. But I think there are programs, UMass Boston, I think that our teacher education program is much more intentional about, trying to help pre-service teachers become aware of what these policies and practices are and about alternatives, and and then placing them with teachers in the public school system that they have relationships with, that they know are working towards these kinds of alternatives. So it's a kind of an intentional, not just let them go anywhere, but who are we connected to? And then I know, for example, the Center X folks at UCLA, with both teacher preparation and principal preparation, one of the things they do is build cohorts that then stay connected, no, not required, but stay connected to each other as they enter schools. So they're trying to place them in schools where they feel like they'll be supported in a more restorative and transformative direction. But then they also feel like these teachers they end up even then often isolated. And being new teachers, we're often, new teachers going into oftentimes the most under-resourced, most challenging school environments, right? They should be going there 5 years later, not right away, So the idea that, well, how can they be supported when they're in these challenging environments, right? So building networks of teachers or principals in this case too, so that people can talk about their practice collectively and reflect on that and try to move. Because, teachers do, it's very difficult, there are, lack of resources. I'm sure you're aware, a lot of children will have an IEP, individualized education plan. It says they're supposed to get these supports, and then they just don't get them, right? So then who's left dealing with the situation? It's the teacher in the classroom who's left dealing with it. And so the child's not being supported, but then they may also be, disruptive in the classroom because they're not getting the supports they need. So what is the answer? To suspend them, or is the answer to support them? But then it's up to the teacher, and if it's a new teacher who's not a lot of experience and not a lot of guidance, I think this is where the road starts to go down for a lot of teachers who might come with the best of intentions and some preparation about what these issues really are. So I think those are the kinds of things I've seen in more intentional work in teacher preparation for preparing people for what the challenges are that they might face. And also finding ways, Stanford University used to do this, I don't think they do it anymore, but they used to place pre-service teachers in community settings for the summer, during the summer, which was the idea being they would have a different kind of relationship to the community. Because, as you probably know, there's a very, very deep-seated, I guess you would say, deficit orientation. You could say racist orientation and classes to low-income families and families of color, where they're seen as problems. And it's part of our larger societal, racism and classism, but it's really deep also in our schools of education. I taught in a school of education for 10 years, and those things are very difficult to challenge them. It takes an intentional effort to challenge them, and then support teachers who want to act differently. And that's the other thing. Most of our schools of education don't teach relationship building, right? There are very few who have a course on how do you build relationships with families. Why isn't that a course? You do, great, right. So, but, and more and more do now. 10 years ago, I think almost no one did. Maybe you did here. But I think that's an important part too. And so the idea, the Stanford idea was that, well, you're going into the community not as the authority figure as a teacher, you're going there to learn and build relationships with people in the community, so that when you enter the schools that are in that community, you have a much broader sense of who the folks are and what they care about. And, it has always struck me, like, how do we have these deficit orientations as parents when, oftentimes these are parents who are, leaders in their church communities, who are organizing softball leagues, who are taking care of people in their community with food and running mutual aid societies. The parents are doing all these amazing leadership things, but then schools look at them as a set of problems, don't see any of what these folks are doing in their community. So, yeah.
Time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Gina Umstead Pratel, faculty member in educational leadership. So A lot of my students are really interested in this issue, and I really enjoyed reading your book. I think one of the things I'm curious about is with all of the students coming out of COVID, in recent years, and obviously a lot of the recent political developments, like all of this great progress that's been made, which still is a lot more is needed at reducing zero tolerance policies. I'm wondering what you found in terms of if any of this progress has been eroded. I know in particular in Kentucky, there was a bill that was passed in 2023 that gave teachers more authority to label students chronically disruptive and, be removed from classroom and ultimately suspended. I don't know if that's really a power that's being used in Kentucky, but I noticed that it was really out of sync with a lot of the other great policy work that's been done in our state around restorative justice, or obviously the great work that our district partners have been doing in the schools. So I'm wondering what you've found.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer it, because it's, the reports and the data are always like a couple of years behind. So it's hard to know. I think that the forward progress of reducing the numbers has probably slowed down or come to a halt. I'm not sure that it's really been reversed. And I think that part of that is because of some of the pushback that occurred during the COVID era, and children are experiencing trauma, they're out of school, and then they're coming into school, and again, rather than investing in the kind of supports, there are incidents that occur that are then widely publicized, and then there's a push to either bring police back or to return back to sort of discipline policies to get these bad kids out of school. So I feel like it's been somewhat of a turbulent period of time. And, the book, in a way, kind of ends at a high point, which, is great, because we have to understand that there are high points, right? There are times when, the broad sweep of the book is really over 25 years. So if you were to start back in the mid-90s and look at the situation, or even in the mid-2000s, and, it was literally true. I mean, we weren't having a conversation about zero. No one was having a conversation almost about zero tolerance in the mid-2000s. It was just a law of the land. So, I do think that even with these kind of rollbacks, these are contentious issues, right? It's not like people are accepting that. And even with policing, it's a contentious issue now. So, I do think it's important both to look at the reality of what we're facing, but also hold on to the ideas that, we can also make changes. And, there's going to be, some periods of up and downs within that, even if the longer arc has been towards, progress too. So I wish I had a better answer for your question, but I've looked, in California they have some numbers, and they say that, in some places suspensions have started to rise a bit, but in others they're still falling and much lower than they used to be. So that's the mixed case that I know about in California. And it is true that it tends to be in places where communities are more organized, that there's a kind of advocacy group in sort of really trying to hold the line or really looking for alternatives. So, yeah. All right.
Last question.
All right.
Hi, my name is Melissa Henry, and I'm a faculty member in clinical mental health counseling. And I'm just putting together some of the ideas that you've talked about so far. So you just shared 2 questions ago about how the Stanford example of where the teachers go in during the summer to the communities.
Right.
And I connected it to, you said you were a community-based researcher in the beginning, and I was thinking about an idea in that approach is to not be an outsider going in. So even the Stanford approach, I'm like, that's still taking outsiders.
Yes.
So are there, and I'm not a teacher,
Yeah.
so are there programs to get people in the community into the teaching pipeline that are
Yes.
non-traditional? Because counseling, especially in the 50s, we had that approach. Because it takes a lot to go get a bachelor's and then a master's, go to a prestigious university. So they just took people off the street. They're like, we're going to train you right now. You don't need a degree.
Yeah.
Is there teaching approaches to that?
Yeah, sure, and others may know even more about it than I do, but for example, the Grow Your Own Teachers program that exists in different kinds of forms, many places across the country, the idea being that, we can grow our teachers from within our community. Some of those are pipelines that start in secondary school for high school students to go through, and then into college, and then into teaching. So, and then presumably teaching in your own community, right, in your own place. There are also Grow Your Own teacher programs for parents and community members. So one I know best, I was just with the folks last weekend at a conference, the Grow Your Own Illinois program. So that grew out of a community organizing effort. I'm not sure if they're up there, Logan Square Neighborhood Association. LSNA, this one. They started organizing parents, mostly Latinx parents, through many of the processes we were talking about. And then they had an idea to develop something called the Parent Mentor Program. And they had parents go into the classroom 2 hours a day to support teachers and build relationships. And then on the Friday, they would have 2 hours of community organizing training. And so the parents were learning about school, they were getting a stipend, they had personal empowerment goals, and then they were learning about community organizing. And then as a result, and it became a large program with like 1,000 parents. So all these parents then started to say, well, we're organizing, what do we want? And one of the issues was, well, why can't we be teachers in our own school? Partly for the reason that you're saying. These are people coming in from the outside who don't know our children, don't know our community. So they launched this Grow Your Own Teacher program. And of course, you have to get funding for that. But it's now across the state of Illinois. I think they have 12 consortiums that are partnerships between teacher training colleges, community-based organizations, and school districts, with the idea that parents or other community members can get, it's a complicated financial model, but subsidized college education leading towards teacher training certificate with the commitment to teach in the schools in your community. So I think there are a number of these. It's challenging because, a lot of the parents also have to get the college degree, as well, right? It's not like they can just become teachers. It's a many-year process and the financial issues. But I do think that's part of the solution, right? It's part of the solution is going to be, all of these, I think, circle around the idea of how do we really connect schools with the communities in which they're serving. And it has to do, and not just connect them, but connect them in a way that is really trying to create empowering environments for our young people and supportive environments for communities. So, there's a lot of ways of doing that, and I think it takes, an intentional effort on the part of those of us who are more in, whether it's in higher education or whether we're in school districts or within schools, we have to be reaching out to partner. But I do think that part of the message of this book is that there also has to be, the reality is that there has to be a force coming out of the community that's really demanding that something change. And it's the combination, I think, of that demand from the community and the changing of the hearts and the minds and the reaching out to form the kinds of alliances. Because parents and young people aren't going to do this on their own. But I also believe that, however well-intentioned we might be, I call that we, however well-intentioned that system is, these deep-seated issues get reproduced. And they need a challenge and they need a demand. And so I guess if that was the last question, I'd like to at least leave people with that. On a hopeful note, right now I think it's a difficult time we're in, but I think we also have to look at that long arc. And I certainly know that communities are not going to ever step away from the demand for education for their children. It just goes back, for African Americans, it goes back to periods of being enslaved and the demand to learn to read and to write, the Reconstruction era, the 60s era. No matter what happens, though, that demand and that movement is not going to go away. And so many Latinx families came to this country for their children to get a good education. They're not giving that up, right? And all the sacrifices they made for that. And I think we have to appreciate that, in the sea of deficit thinking, in the sea of looking at communities and people as problems, we have to see that what people in the community are really bringing to education is that vision for access, for quality, for liberation for their children, and become a part of and allies and participants in that movement. So that's how I'd like to leave you with that thought.
Well, everyone, thank you if you joined us in person for coming today. If you're watching on the live stream, thank you. If you're watching at some point in the future, again, thank you for joining us. Let's express our appreciation to Dr. Warren. Thank you again. Have a great day.
All right.